He raised his glass and smiled. Not the warm kind people offer when they mean well, but the practiced smile people wear when cruelty is wrapped in manners, the kind that never reaches the eyes. To Riley, Walter said, his voice smooth and confident as it carried across the ballroom. May she finally have a stable family, something her sister could never give her. Laughter rippled through the room, light and polite, bouncing off marble walls and crystal chandeliers. 200 guests laughed because silence would have felt uncomfortable, because they had no idea what that sentence cost, because cruelty is easy when you don't recognize it. I didn't laugh. My name is Clorinda Piton, and the man humiliating me in front of everyone I loved was standing on ground already cracked beneath his feet. For 20 years, I carried silence like a buried fault line. For 20 years, I lived with the weight of parents who never came home. Tonight, the pressure had reached its breaking point. The ballroom shimmered beneath a glass ceiling, snow reflecting from the mountains outside like scattered diamonds. Every chandelier glinted with wealth and perfection. The air smelled of expensive perfume, polished wood, and wine that cost more than my first year of rent. A jazz band played something light and meaningless, music designed to smooth over pauses and fill the space between empty compliments. I sat at the farthest table, half hidden behind crystal centerpieces and candlelight, watching my sister. Riley stood near the head table in her white gown, radiant and fragile all at once. Her smile was flawless to anyone who didn't know her. To me it trembled, just slightly, a flicker of nerves she tried to swallow. I raised her. I noticed everything. At the center of the room stood Walter Harrington. Tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, a man who carried authority like he'd been born with it. He held his wine glass as if blessing the world, as if every word he spoke deserved applause. Here's to Riley, he continued, lifting his glass higher. A lovely young woman who finally has the stability she deserves. He paused, something she clearly never had growing up. The laugh that followed wasn't as confident. Someone clinked a glass too loudly. Another guest cleared their throat. Riley's fingers tightened around the tablecloth, her knuckles pale beneath the lace. She didn't look at me, she couldn't. I watched the red wine swirl in Walter's glass, catching chandelier light like fresh blood. When I stood, chairs creaked softly around me, heads turned, the music stumbled and faded. Mr. Harrington, I said calmly, my voice steady enough to make people uneasy. Do you even know what stability costs? Silence dropped like a heavy curtain. Walter blinked, momentarily surprised. His smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second before returning, thinner now. Ah, he said softly. The sister speaks. I smiled, not at him, but at Riley. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear and something deeper, something she didn't want uncovered. I sat back down, my movements slow and deliberate. He thinks this is about pride, I thought, but this is about foundations. And his are already failing. Somewhere in the room, a phone buzzed. Walter frowned and reached into his pocket. The glow from his screen reflected faintly against his face. Denver Daily Investigations. Harrington mining investigation reopened. The color drained from his skin. My smile didn't change. It deepened, quiet, certain, inevitable. The night the mine collapsed still claws at my memory. Sirens screamed through the winter air, slicing the darkness apart. Snow fell thick and heavy, mixing with coal dust until the air burned my lungs. I was 17, standing behind a chain-link fence, my hands frozen to the metal as rescue lights flashed red and blue across the mountain. Men shouted. Radios crackled. Someone yelled that the shaft had caved. They said no one was left inside, but I knew. My parents hadn't come home. Hours later, the mountain went silent. Too silent. Someone whispered that the beams hadn't been reinforced, that shortcuts had been taken, that the roof had given in. The next morning, the newspaper told a prettier story. Natural quake causes tragic mining accident. I carried that paper into the Harrington mining office with shaking hands. A man behind the desk didn't even look up when I stopped. In front of him. You should move on, kid, he said flatly. Harrington paid enough. He didn't see me reach for the report on his desk. The ink was faint, but one line burned through the page like fire. Approved for cost reduction. W. Harrington. That was the day I stopped believing in accidents. Years passed in fragments. Steel dust, concrete, the the scream of drills biting into stone. I worked construction sites by day and studied engineering by night. I learned how buildings failed, where pressure collected, how small compromises became disasters. I raised Riley in the evenings, cheap apartments, shared dinners, homework at the kitchen table. She learned how to draw, learned how to laugh. I learned how to stop dreaming. I learned how to wait. Now our parents' photograph sits on my desk, light flickering across their faces like fire trapped behind glass. Their smiles are frozen in time, alive, unaware. If he built his empire on broken beams, I whisper sometimes, then I'll be the one to bring it down. My phone buzzed late one night. Claire, Derek proposed. You'll love his family. My fingers tightened around the phone until my palm stung. She didn't know. She was marrying the son of the man who killed our parents. I stared at the screen long after it went dark, the weight of 20 years settling into place. The ground beneath all of us had already begun to shift, and this time I wasn't going to look away. The Harrington estate rose from the hillside like some thing designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Glass walls reflected the vineyard rows stretching endlessly behind it, each line precise, controlled, expensive. Even the air felt curated, clean, cold, and faintly sweet, like money polished until it forgot the smell of labor. Riley squeezed my hand as we walked up the stone path. Just, please try, she whispered, forcing a smile that didn't quite hold. They're important to Derek. I nodded, though my eyes were already tracking the structure of the house, the load-bearing beams visible behind decorative glass, the deliberate symmetry, the confidence of something built to look unbreakable. Inside, warmth wrapped around us, artificial and perfect. Soft lighting, muted colors, art that cost more than most people's homes. At the center of it all sat Walter Harrington, his presence as heavy as the gold watch on his wrist. He stood when we entered, offering a handshake that lingered half a second too long. So this is the famous sister, he said, studying me slowly, the way men do when they've already decided you don't belong. Clorinda, isn't it? Claire, I corrected. A civil engineer, he continued, swirling the wine in his glass. So you build things that eventually collapse. I met his eyes without blinking, only when people removed the supports. For the briefest moment, his smile froze. Then it returned, thinner, sharper. Of course, dinner unfolded with polished conversation and sharpened edges. Compliments were apt around subtle insults. Laughter that never quite reached the eyes. Derek tried to keep things light, his hand resting protectively on Riley's knee, unaware of the ground cracking beneath him. On the wall behind Walter hung a framed family portrait. Walter, his wife, Derek, and behind them, visible through a wide window, the same mountain ridge where the mine had collapsed 20 years ago. The chandelier's reflection cut across the glass, slicing the image like a fracture. He'd placed it there on purpose. I won. When dinner ended, I stepped outside into the cold, kneading air that hadn't been filtered through wealth and lies. Snow crunched beneath my boots. Derek followed me out, his hands buried in his coat pockets. He's difficult, he said quietly, but he's not all bad. I looked at him then, really looked. Kind eyes, honest confusion, a man raised inside a structure he'd never examined. You've never seen the beams from the inside, I said softly. He frowned, unsure what to say. I left him standing there, the warm glow of the estate spilling onto the snow like light through spreading cracks. That night, back in my apartment, I opened my laptop. The familiar hum of the screen filled the dark room. I scrolled through files I hadn't touched in years until one stopped me cold. Site report, Rocky Ridge extension, a new mine, a new project, a new sin. The blueprints glowed on the screen. Load-bearing compromised, reinforcement skipped, supervisor approval. W. Harrington. My fingers moved without hesitation. I sent the file to Lennox. His reply came less than 10 minutes later. If this checks out, it's homicide. The next afternoon, Riley called. Her voice cracked before she even spoke. Why did you talk to a reporter? She demanded. Why are people saying things about Derek's father? I didn't, I said calmly. Not yet. You're trying to ruin him, she cried. You're trying to ruin us. I'm not ruining anyone, I said quietly. I'm rebuilding what they broke. She hung up. The silence that followed felt like a crater opening between us. Hours later, Lennox's next message arrived. Follow the money. By midnight, the numbers were clear. $3.2 million missing from an environmental safety fund, laundered through offshore accounts, clean on paper, deadly in reality. They died for $3 million, I whispered to my parents' photograph. That night, an envelope appeared beneath my door. Inside was a map of another mine, red zones circled in ink, unsafe areas clearly marked. At the bottom, a single line was scrawled. He's doing it again. I found Riley the next morning standing in front of a mirror, forcing a smile as she tried on earrings. Walter's paying for our honeymoon, she said lightly. Then he's buying your silence, I replied. Her reflection shattered into anger. You're obsessed. No, I said. I'm precise. She slammed the door between us, the glass rattling like a stress fracture. Back home, my desk became a war map. Blueprints, schedules, names, arrows connecting accounts to people, people to decisions, decisions to deaths. I traced failure lines in red ink, stress points, collapse zones. Below it all, I wrote 2 letters, WH. A week later, Riley twirled in her wedding gown, laughing as Derek told her she looked perfect. My phone buzzed. SEC confirms investigation, right on schedule. That night, Derek came to see me. His voice was low, shaken. If you know something about my father, he said, tell me. I met his eyes. Would you still marry someone who profits from the dead? He didn't answer. The next morning, Riley confronted me again, her eyes wild with exhaustion and fear. You can't let this go, she said. You're tearing everything apart. Time doesn't bury truth, I replied. It exposes what wasn't built right. Then Lennox called. Walter knows. Then he's looking in the wrong place, I said. Moments later, another message arrived. He's laundering money through Riley's name. My stomach dropped. I sat alone that night, staring at my notebook. If I stop now, he wins. If I continue, she suffers. Justice always breaks something. Snow began to fall outside, quiet and relentless. I sent Lennox one final text. Wedding day, 2:15 p.m. When he raises his glass. Before dawn, I placed my father's old drafting pencil beside Riley's bed. Its metal edges were worn smooth by years of work. Engraved into its side were the words he'd lived by. Build to last. You don't know it yet, I whispered, closing the door softly behind me. But this time, I'm building for both of us. 3 days before the wedding, I drove alone to the outskirts of Denver and stood before the old Harrington mine. The air was damp and bitter. Rust clung to the beams like dried blood. The walls were cracked, eaten by time and neglect. Everything looked the same as it had that night, only quieter. I ran my fingers along a faded engraving carved into the stone. Safety first. You forgot your own words, I whispered. The mountain said nothing, but it remembered. And so did I. Snow drifted across the road as I drove back from the mine, the sky low and heavy, pressing against the mountains like a held breath. By the time I reached my apartment, night had settled in fully. Inside, my desk was no longer just a workspace. It was a battlefield. Blueprints covered every surface. Timelines ran along the walls, names, dates, account numbers, and site reports connected by red lines that looked like veins under strain. Every piece fit together with the certainty of physics. This wasn't revenge. This was structural failure, calculated and inevitable. My laptop chimed. Lennox's face appeared on the screen, tired but focused. Are you sure about the timing? He asked. Once this goes public, there's no stopping it. He'll raise his glass at 2:15, I said. Make sure the world is watching. At that same hour, an anonymous email slipped. And to Walter Harrington's private inbox. SEC knows. Within minutes, his office erupted into chaos. Assistants scrambled. Lawyers were summoned. He ordered a full internal audit, digging through archived servers, financial records, even the system I had once accessed years ago. He found nothing. I had erased every trace long ago. The evidence lived somewhere far beyond his reach now, mirrored, duplicated, impossible to bury. That evening, Riley came to my door. Her voice shook. Derek says the company's in trouble. He says it's you. I met her gaze, steady. It was never me, it was the truth. Please, she whispered. If you love me, stop. I can't stop what started 20 years ago, I said gently. You don't end a collapse by pretending the cracks aren't there. She stared at me like she no longer recognized the sister who raised her. The next morning, I sent Walter a wedding gift. An elegant silver frame. Inside it, a photograph of the collapsed mine, taken years ago. But beneath the glossy surface, barely visible unless the light hit just right, were overlaid transaction records. Offshore transfers, shell accounts, dates and signatures. On the back, I'd engraved one line, "Foundations don't lie." A hidden lens inside the frame would capture his face when he opened it. By afternoon, he summoned me to a downtown cafe. You think you can fight me with paper? He said quietly, his eyes sharp. I bury people with paper. Not this time, I replied. This time. The paper signs your fall. His smile turned cold. When foundations collapse, everything above them goes too. Even your sister. He stood and left. Minutes later, Lennox called. Someone leaked the timeline. Another outlet is about to publish early. Move it up, I said. He'll toast at 1:45. Only I knew the change. That night, I opened my father's old safe. Inside lay his drafting pencil and the original construction permit for the Harrington mine. On the last page of my notebook, I wrote, Blueprint of justice. Cracks aligned, collapse imminent. Before dawn, Riley slipped a folded note under my door. Whatever happens tomorrow, please don't forget I love you. I folded it carefully and placed it in my coat pocket. Morning came bright and blinding. Snow had stopped. Sunlight spilled across the mountains like a warning and a promise all at once. The ballroom in Aspen gleamed white and perfect. Guests laughed softly, cameras flashed, violins filled the air, champagne flowed freely. Only I sat still, my glass untouched, watching the clock. 1:45. Walter straightened his tie and raised his wine. To Riley and Derek, he said smoothly, may your marriage stand stronger than some foundations we've seen before. Laughter rippled. I stood. You talk about foundations, Mr. Harrington, I said, my voice carrying clean and calm. But do you even know what keeps the ground stable? He smirked. An engineer's lesson? You built your empire on hollow ground. I said, I'm here to make sure it collapses. His phone buzzed. His face drained of color. Behind him, the wedding screen flickered. Headlines exploded across it. Harrington mining under federal investigation. Illegal transfers exposed. Falsified safety reports. Derek shouted, You used our names for this? Walter said nothing. Riley sobbed. Walk away, I said softly to her. Now. She took Derek's hand, and they left. Walter slumped, wine spilling across white linen like blood. By morning, his arrest filled every screen. Walter Harrington, detained by federal authorities. SEC and FBI confirm multiple investigations. I turned off the television. Later, Riley stood in my doorway, eyes red, voice breaking. You destroyed my husband's family. No, I said quietly. I stopped pretending your happiness wasn't built on lies. Silence stretched between us until it finally cracked. Weeks passed. The company dissolved. Assets were seized. Funds restored. The Piton Memorial Trust was established in my parents' names. A year later, the old mine had become a sanctuary. Grass covered the rubble. A marble monument stood where the shaft had once collapsed. I knelt, laying white lilies at its base. Build to last. Lennox approached behind me. Do you regret it? No, I said. You can't rebuild without breaking first. He handed me an envelope. Riley wanted you to have this. Inside, her handwriting flowed steady and sure. I'm naming our daughter Clara. I want her tea. Oh, know what real foundations mean. I smiled. Small. Quiet. The first real one in 20 years. As I walked away, sunlight spilled gold across the valley. They called it revenge. I called it restoration.